Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, we bring in our speechwriting experts to unpack the President's State of the Union address. Lance Izumi, PRI Senior Director of Education, was a speechwriter for Governor Deukmejian and Attorney General Ed Meese. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, wrote speeches for California elected officials, including Governor Schwarzenegger. And I wrote speeches for Governor Wilson and was also a researcher at President Reagan's speechwriting staff. Because of the government closure and the tit-for-tat going on in Washington, it's the first time in my memory that the State of the Union had to be delayed. So even before the first word was spoken, the speech was already controversial out of the gates. Let's hear what our experts have to say. Thanks for joining us. Well, it seems that this year that the most controversial aspect of the State of the Union address was just agreeing upon a date. The president's speech was delayed about a week as he and Speaker Pelosi squabbled over the government shutdown. Ultimately, despite his threats to the contrary, President Trump went along with Speaker Pelosi's delay. So let's go behind the scenes here. As former speechwriters, how would a week-long delay or a major last-minute change have impacted your work in writing a big speech? How would a delay affect the principal when delivering a speech?
I think it would have caused us to, in my speechwriting shop anyway, whether it's at the governor's office when I was chief speechwriter for Governor Deukmejian, or in the Attorney General's office when I was Ed Meese's speechwriter back in the Reagan administration, it would have probably caused us to keep some space open to talk about any new developments that may have gone on in the intervening time between when the speech was scheduled and when the speech actually plays. You have to be able to insert things, depending on, what's happening, or else depending on public sentiment. So, for example, like one of the things that I think is interesting, in this delay has been the fact that Nancy Pelosi's ratings have actually fallen. And actually, when you look at President Trump's ratings, they've actually gone up. I mean, the latest Rasmussen report says that he's actually at nearly 50% approval rating. So I think that, that's the kind of thing that you look to see what kind of political capital do you have, what kinds of issues do you want to insert, to take advantage of the situation.
When you're working on a big speech like a State of the Union, you're literally working on it up to the last minute. We know that any kind of delay like this would have surely opened up major sections of the speech for a second thought. And what our listeners may not appreciate is it's not just one person writing the speech and going through it with another person. It's writing by committee. There's so many sets of eyes on the State of the Union or the State of the State. So any little change would have brought about so much input from so many other people. It's almost a house of cards almost of changes to a speech. For Governor Schwarzenegger, he would have rehearsed that thing probably 25 times between mid-December or so when you have a pretty good draft of it. And then he'd, of course, have a teleprompter in Sacramento, and he'd go through it multiple times a day. And I saw the president actually was rehearsing it, several times this week. So, if you've got kind of your speech set and then you have a major change, that's very hard for the principal to at the last minute.
So who won the battle over the date of the State of the Union? Did the president miss an opportunity to go around Congress and give his speech where and when he pleased? Will the delay ultimately overshadow what the president said tonight?
Well, first of all, I don't think that the delay, is going to overshadow the president's speech because, I believe that this was probably the best speech that President Trump has ever given. I think that the president was able to balance both being a unifier, but also putting forth his policy points that, are important to him. If you look at the delay of him giving this speech, it was right of him to wait until there was agreement for him to give it in front of Congress. I think that he was incredibly effective, in giving this speech. He used both the topics in the speech, the themes in the speech, but also the people he brought to the speech very effectively and interwove that with his appeals to different parts of Congress. And so even the Democrats in many instances were forced to get up and stand and applaud the president. And that, had the effect of showing that the president was a unifier. And I think that when you take a step back and look at, who's the loser, the person who forced the delay, Nancy Pelosi, is the person who ends up losing because the president delivers this really great speech. Well, why didn't you let the president deliver it when he was supposed to?
It was obvious that the shutdown was the 800-pound gorilla in the room tonight. Right from the word go, though the president in his delivery gave a very powerful and uplifting speech, he was ready to rumble. I don't know if you noticed, but the very first thing when he came up to the podium, normally the speaker, the president comes up, there's applause, the applause dies down, then the speaker says, I'm pleased to present the President of the United States. He didn't give give her the opportunity to do that. And I don't know if that was on purpose or if that just how it happened in the moment. And it clearly got to her because you could tell that threw her off, and the weirdness with her and the rustling of the papers and all of that. As a matter of course of, are they going to be able to move beyond this and reach a deal on, in, I think, 10 days from now, we have to have a deal or government could shut down again. I think probably everybody's in their corners. But the president was, from the word go when the speech started, he was able to do his thing and tell the story he wanted to tell, and make the tough points as well. Yes, that would have been the case if he was standing in the Oval Office or in a Union Hall in Georgia. There's something about being there in the room and the pageantry of it, and that moment it commands your attention, and most people, regardless of political stripe, take that moment to listen, and I think location does matter as far as the speech goes.
One of the things that has become common in the State of the Union address, especially in this era of divided government, is the partisan response from the crowd. In your experience, how did the expected response from the crowd in the room affect your speech writing process and how your principal prepared for the speech? Did you try to avoid a partisan response or lean into it by writing lines sure to tick off the other side?
Well, I think that it really depends on what we wanted from the speech and who was our ultimate audience for the speech. The seated audience is not always the ultimate audience for the speech. It could be that the wider audience who may see the speech on TV, as in this case with the State of the Union, where you have massive numbers of people who are watching this speech, they're really the target audience for this. It's not the congressman or congresswoman so-and-so who sit in row 6. You want that ultimate audience who are watching on TV or other media to get the messages that you want to communicate to them. In that case, getting the seated audience riled up could actually play into your hands by demonstrating to your ultimate audience, the wider audience, the sensibleness of the speech giver's positions and the irrationality and bad manners of the opponents in the seated audience. In a certain sense, you are using those seated members as part of your props in your speech because for example, that the opposition may, jeer or, as you mentioned, Tim, sit on their hands or whatever, but those images are then going to be broadcast to the wider public. Now, the base of the other party may love that, but if you know, for example, that a majority of the American people support your position, using that image to show that the opposition party is not supporting the position that's supported by the majority of the American people, well, that is to the president's benefit.
I think you're exactly right. We certainly saw that already on Twitter. You're seeing the meme of Kirsten Gillibrand rolling her eyes and a lot of, Pelosi and her weird facial reaction and the papers behind her. Your speech should be geared to the folks at home, those who are watching it, the masses. And I think that's a problem with a lot of the political communications in Washington and Sacramento and government towns in general. You should always be playing to the folks back home because they're the ones who elect you. You're never going to get the approval of people inside the Beltway. Now, I have an entertaining story. So when Governor Schwarzenegger was in office, as we mentioned earlier, the speaker usually introduces the president. Well, the lieutenant governor usually introduces the governor in the state of the state. And it's the same kind of thing, very brief, thank you, maybe a minute, now I'm pleased to introduce the governor. Well, we had the great Cruz Bustamante was the lieutenant governor, and the very first state of the state, he proceeded to stand up and give like a 5-minute speech. Now, keep in mind, Governor Schwarzenegger defeated him in the recall election, so obviously there was a little bit of a tension there, but we were not prepared for that at all. That was just bizarre, and so the governor didn't miss a beat. When he finally had his chance to speak, he looked at Cruz Bustamante and said, "Nice speech." Every year after that, while Cruz Bustamante was still lieutenant governor, we had pages of jokes ready to go if the lieutenant governor was going to deliver another stem winder from the podium there.
Let's dive into the specifics of the speech. First, what's your one major takeaway from the president's address to Congress? What impact do you think the speech will have in influencing that policy area?
Well, I think that my major takeaway is that not only was it like an extremely well-delivered speech, a well-crafted speech, but I think that just the fact that this is probably the most unifying speech that I've ever seen President Trump deliver. And so, I mean, from the very get-go, he urged compromise and common ground, for which Nancy Pelosi stood up and applauded, gave the president a standing ovation for that line. And he, went out of his way to try and stress some themes that would be supported by both sides of the aisle. For example, the importance of women in the workforce, the fact that you have more women than ever before who are getting the new jobs in this economy. That was a huge applause winner from all those Democratic congresswomen in white today. And the fact that when they were all applauding, he told them, and this was, I thought, a very effective use of humor, is he said, "Hey, don't sit down yet. You're going to like what I'm about to say even more." And he then talked about how there were more women members of Congress in this Congress than ever before as well. So I think that those sorts of efforts to reach across the aisle, to lay the landscape for compromise, while he, certainly laid out his positions very strongly on issues such as immigration and foreign policy and the like, I do think that his tone and of reaching across the aisles, plus also the tone of having this be an American speech as opposed to a Republican president delivering a list of "I want this" and "I want that," which is often the case in these State of the Union speeches, but weaving in, as I mentioned before, these personal stories from the people who he invited into the gallery, I thought made this a unifying American speech.
For Trump, it was probably the most effective speech he has delivered. Now, there were elements, and we can tell as speechwriters, this speech was written by committee too. It's obvious. I wish whoever wrote the 5 minutes at the end wrote the whole speech, because that unifying message and that challenge for let's work together, let's work through our differences, whoever that person is, that person should be writing all of Trump's speeches. I think everyone agreed that was a home run. My takeaway from tonight, not so much on a policy issue, but boy, the division is real. And you see it. And you see the contempt, when the camera would pan to the Democratic side of the aisle. Poor Joe Manchin, you saw him stand up because he's actually a pretty independent thinker. Boy, the anger, the childish kind of chatting to one another and giggling, and the weirdness of Pelosi almost having to orchestrate, the Democrats, when to sit down and when to stand up. And even the beginning, when you have the traditional, when the president walks down the aisle, everyone wants to shake his hand. Well, Republicans, if you look at the tape, it was Republicans on both sides of the aisle. Democrats didn't want to be anywhere near that camera shot. And for both parties, that's a moment, regardless of the party. So for me, that was my takeaway, was the division is real.
Naturally, two topics were much anticipated in this year's State of the Union: the government shutdown and immigration. How effectively do you think both President Trump and Democrats in their response made their case to the American people on these issues? After hearing what they said, is another government shutdown all but inevitable in the next few days?
I mean, I think that it depends. I mean, first of all, let's talk about the government shutdown and immigration. Now, I think that the president was very effective in talking about immigration. He was specific. He emphasized the impact of having a physical barrier and what that means to Americans, especially, for example, having the border agent the ICE agent up in the crowd, plus the family of the two very unfortunate 80-something-year-old victims from Reno, Nevada. I thought that was a very effective use of a personal story to underscore his point. That was also then couched with saying that, look, what we need to do is solve this problem for the American people, and that, we need to come together and compromise. So I think that if you look at the Democratic response, and I will talk more about Stacey Abrams in a minute, but I think if you look at her response, there was very little in it to suggest that there was going to be any real proposal by the Democrats to try and achieve that common ground, which again is the reason ultimately for the government shutdown. And I think that one of the things the Democrats have to worry about is the polling data is showing that Democrats want their party to become more moderate, not more far leftist as the party is being told right now.
Well, I agree that I thought the human element, the family from Reno, I thought the ICE agent, that was very powerful. I thought it was interesting, too, that Trump used the language of his opponents against them. The talk of, and this is one of the things about being coached to stand up, when he talked about sex slavery and human trafficking and all of that, those aren't partisan issues, but it's something that you see a lot of Democrats and Democratic women talk about. And it was stunning to see those members of Congress, they didn't know whether to applaud or not, or what they should do. I think on the shutdown in general, Trump wasn't as strong on that because he didn't really offer, it was more a few words, and that was it. But I thought that he could have made a stronger case for, here's what the shutdown's about, here's what I want to do, here's, specifically on the shutdown. I thought he could have made the case stronger. Abrams, I thought she did a good job humanizing, here were the real world impact of the shutdown. Problem is, most Americans didn't feel the impact of the shutdown at all. The government was closed for 2 weeks and they pretty much yawned. So it was kind of a stretch on her part to say that, but I thought it was an effective way to try and change the debate a little bit.
State of the Union addresses inevitably become laundry list speeches. Political observers have their checklist out, looking for the president to give lip service to virtually every policy area. The dirty little secret is that speechwriters can't stand writing these laundry list speeches. They're tough to write, usually boring to hear, and they're written by a committee. What laundry list item were you surprised that the president omitted or shortchanged in his speech? Was it a lost opportunity to move the needle on this issue?
I wouldn't say necessarily terms shortchanging. For example, the president did mention school choice, which he has not mentioned before. And the simple fact that he mentioned school choice in his speech, I think is a huge plus. And so, yes, it did not get obviously the kind of tension or, time that foreign policy did, immigration did. But again, the fact that the president rarely mentions that issue, but decide to mention it in the State of the Union, I think is a huge victory for those who support school choice. Now, the question is, of course, the devil is in the details. What is he going to propose in this area? So, and I know that there are conservatives, who are, good conservatives on both sides of whether the federal government should be involved in any kind of school choice initiative. I totally understand that. But I think simply from a rhetorical point of view and pointing to an issue that has resonance with many Americans, pointing to school choice as a solution to many of our education ills was a huge thing, and that's a huge plus in my book for the president.
Well, for me, it was the deficit and government overspending. There really wasn't one word about that in his speech tonight. And now we know the Democrats want to spend. They're not interested in cutting spending at all on anything. It's been disappointing to see Republicans, especially over the last 2 years, abandon what I always thought was a core component of the Republican platform, was cutting government and cutting spending. Even under budget hawk Paul Ryan, they did that. And disappointingly, the thinking in the White House is that it's kind of a loser or it doesn't move the needle. Mick Mulvaney was quoted in some of the coverage today as saying that really nobody cares about the deficit, and that's unfortunate.
One of the Democrats' rising stars nationally, former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, gave their party response. How do you grade her response for effectiveness and delivery? And in your experience, how challenging is it to be on the other side, writing or delivering speech in advance, responding to something that you don't really know?
There are inherent difficulties with giving the response. First of all, everybody knows who the president is, right? And so you don't have to introduce yourself to the American people. Whereas in Stacey Abrams' case, in the case of all the others who give the opposition response, they actually spend a chunk of time at the beginning introducing who they are. And so what that does is that, first of all, it takes away time from the policy or political points you're trying to make, but also, too, it ends up making the speech seem like a campaign speech, because what's the difference between hearing Stacey Abrams' speech and like hearing maybe that same speech that she gave to maybe some labor union in Georgia? She's there in front of a very small little audience of people in the background, and she's giving this speech, and to rise above the limitations of the space that she occupies is very difficult. It would take an extraordinary speech in a very limited time, which she had, to do that. What I heard in that speech was not a lot of unifying things, because if American people are upset that there is division in the country, I don't think that when you listen to Stacey Abrams' speech that you felt there was any healing coming from her.
I think you're exactly right. right. I think if you are on the left and you watched her speech tonight, you would say, as the kids would say, yes, queen. They loved it. There's a lot of downside to delivering these speeches, and there's usually very little upside. I can't remember anybody who ever hit a home run. You never know when you're going to have a weird moment like Marco Rubio and his weird water drinking moment, or like tonight, that was very weird, staging all these people just standing around behind her, and it actually kind of looked like she was on a green screen too. I thought her speech, it was like we were living in an alternate universe, because she talked about plants closing and all these jobs leaving. Well, that's not the reality. We have the lowest unemployment, as we've talked about at PRI. We're going to have 3% annual growth. I don't know where she's living that's happening, because it just isn't. I think that was the Democrats so wanted to trash the president, they can't even acknowledge, hey, the facts are the facts. You're right. It was one of those that it ticked off all the boxes to the various liberal constituencies. It was in a union hall, all the talk of hitting something that all the different groups would like. But then it was also with it. It was like relitigating her race. She lost very narrowly. So she spent so much of the speech on, quote, voter suppression and all these things. Well, that's not the national vision of the Democrats. That's her story. Really, your goal should be to deliver, here's our alternative. Here's what we would do. Here's our philosophy. Here's our values. I think that's a much better way to deliver these kinds of speeches, but usually Democrat or Republican, they're kind of a version of what she delivered.
One of the traditions of the State of the Union is to highlight Americans and interweave them in the speech to make a point about various policy reforms the president wants to offer in the State of the Union. What did you make of tonight's Americans that were highlighted and the Democratic response? Did any one person stand out as a symbol that will resonate with folks? Do you think that these staged human stories are effective ways for principals to emphasize their point with the folks back home?
The president used the people in the gallery who he had invited and who he mentioned in his speech really effectively. I think what's interesting is the way the president used people who came from different walks of life to, again, going back to this issue of unifying the country. Starting off with the World War II veterans, I thought was very good, and then ending with linking the World War II veteran who was landing at Normandy but then liberated Dachau with a concentration camp survivor from Pittsburgh. I thought that was a very effective use of the people in the audience who he had invited. And this wasn't a Republican or Democrat issue, but it was, a unifying theme to heal a divided nation.
The one that I thought was interesting that you didn't mention and that I think really resonates, the president's had this focus on, quote, criminal justice reform, but there's no question that Alice Johnson and then the other fellow, that Matthew Charles, who I saw a report on him before the State of the State, and they went into more of his story. Boy, that guy had a raw deal. He was finally paroled, and then the courts reinstated his sentence. So after he was let out for good behavior, they sent him back. So that, to me, and those are two obviously shining examples. I think if you look at it in terms of promoting your agenda, those were the two most effective examples to promote that his agenda is the right agenda and will benefit regular people, because you couldn't help but look at those people and say, hey, one of them could be me.
Finally, let's look at this year's State of the Union from a historical perspective. While the speech was just delivered, what do you think were the most memorable lines or passages in the speech? And when you look back in history at this speech, what do you think will be the takeaway from historians about the state of our national affairs in 2019?
I think we're going to remember this speech, Abe, because, you and I both agree that it's probably the best speech that Donald Trump has ever given. In terms of speech that is effective in bringing, as I say, this theme of bringing the country together, I thought this was a really excellent speech. I think that what will make this speech effective is what the president does in the follow-up to this speech. Because all speeches, no matter how good they are, if there's no bang, after you get the rhetoric, then they're often forgotten, or you remember them more as being empty shells. And so I think a lot of it would depend on what the president does substantively in trying to create compromises that he wants to do. I think you were right about the citation of the criminal justice reform bills that were bipartisan and that he signed, that those were great examples of the Congress coming together and the president, with the president, passed some very important legislation.
Well, I take a more pessimistic view. I think we'll be off to the next fight within probably 48 hours from now, and I'm not too optimistic that we'll remember what he said by Friday.
For Lance Izumi and Tim Anaya, thanks for joining us. A few announcements. On February 28th, PRI is holding a day-long policy conference in Sacramento, followed by, of course, wine tasting. On Saturday, March 23rd, Tucker Carlson will be our keynote speaker at our 40th anniversary gala in San Francisco. Details for both events are on our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back for our next round with PRI.